So in what possible sense was Stalin's economic transformation a failure? Well, the economy was not without its weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Take agriculture as an example. Stalin had driven the peasantry into collective farms and taken control of the grain supply. New technologies were introduced, and labor freed up for use in industry. But the regime never paid collective farmers enough, and this affected productivity. And agriculture came to be a drag on the expansion of industry. Industry itself was not without problems. The Soviet industrial economy was not so much a planned economy as a command economy. The economic plan of every factory was raised every year. Every year they were asked to produce more with fewer inputs. Factory managers responded to the relentless pressure with various coping mechanisms. They hid capacities. They overestimated their need for inputs. They deliberately degraded the quality of production if it helped them to produce more. And they played with the assortment of production. So, for example, if the plan came for production of nails or shoes by number, they would produce a huge quantity of small nails. Or if the plan was in weight, they would produce a huge quantity of large nails, okay? Which wasn't always helpful to the national plan. Factories might exceed targets in one category of production and have a shortfall in another. They might have an excess of inputs in one category and a shortfall in another, but they would trade the excesses to make up for the shortfalls. And what emerged was a thriving black market in industrial goods, an unofficial economy that allowed the official one to work. But all these mechanisms were ultimately corrupt and inefficient. Now, the Soviet economy had had an enormous advantage in the late 1920s and 1930s. The Soviets had been able to overcome backwardness by adopting technologies that had been developed in the capitalist West. And once they could produce iron, steel, and machines, the economy could grow rapidly by reproducing itself. Dig new mines to produce more ores and fuels. More fuels and ores make more metals make more machines that let you dig more mines. And this was the greatest strength of the Soviet economy. But it masks a grave weakness. The system was not good at producing consumer goods or responding to consumer demand. Nor was it good at innovation, producing new goods to meet new demands. And in the middle of the 20th century, the economies of the capitalist West were changing fundamentally. They were moving away from heavy industry towards the production of consumer goods. After World War II, the great expansion of the European and American economies was driven by a huge growth in the production and consumption of consumer goods. The refrigerator, the television set, the car. By the 1970s, the majority of the gross national product in these states came from the consumer sector. And the Soviet economy began to lag ever farther behind. But there were even deeper problems with the economic system Stalin had created. It did not appear to be leading to socialism. Back in 1936, Stalin's old enemy Trotsky published a book in exile entitled The Revolution Betrayed. That book observed how Stalin was abandoning many of the principal aims of the revolution. Now, we don't have enough time to examine these in depth, so let me focus on a few key points. Trotsky observed that from the early 1930s, the regime had abandoned the principle of egalitarianism. There appeared to be a growing gap. There was a growing gap between the rich and the poor, between the best paid and the worst paid workers. Instead of everybody being equal comrades, there was a growing gap between the power of the bosses, the senior officials, and everybody else. Stalin was well aware of this gap, and he defended it as a necessity. And it's not difficult to see why. In this period of rapid industrialization, the Soviet economy needed people with key skills: engineers, administrators, and so on. If you pay them as much as you pay someone who digs trenches, there will be little incentive to develop the skills the regime needed. Now, the differences in pay could be quite stark, from, say, under a couple hundred rubles a month for a manual laborer to over 1,000 for an enterprise director. And the return of the inequality was about more than just differences in pay. It was about the new relationship between bosses and their subordinates. No longer were they simply comrades and equals. For Stalin, in the context of this demanding 5-year plan, there had to be discipline and clear lines of authority. If things were going to get done efficiently, a few people had to give orders and the rest had to carry them out. In short, Stalin didn't think the radically egalitarian communist vision could be achieved without a prolonged period of inequality. The problem was, once the inequality was accepted, it was almost impossible to reverse. The bosses were never willing to give up the privileges and powers they had obtained, and the system became ever more corrupt. Bolsheviks, like other Marxists, thought that the state would get smaller as progress was made towards communism. But from the time of Stalin, it only got larger. Larger, more unwieldy, more corrupt, and less interested in Marxism-Leninism. In a sense, Trotsky was right. Stalin had betrayed the revolution. But if Stalin had betrayed the revolution, it wasn't a deliberate act, as Trotsky argued. Trotsky thought that Stalin was deliberately serving the interests of the petty bourgeois bureaucrats by moving away from key ideals of the revolution. But it is clear that Stalin remained focused on revolutionary aims throughout. He never consciously betrayed the revolution. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, like all other Bolsheviks, Stalin believed that in order to build a communist society, it was necessary, first and foremost, to overcome Russian backwardness. His approach to the problem achieved some remarkable successes, but the approach was also fatally flawed. Neither he nor his successors, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, understood that the successes of the Stalin period were unsustainable, and that the system was ever less responsive, more bloated and corrupt. Gorbachev's attempts to reform it in the late 1980s only succeeded in causing it to crumble.